Live from the studios of KCPT Channel 19 in Kansas City, Missouri, the American Public Works Association is proud to present today's interactive video conference, Managing Change in Local Government, Removing the Fear Factor. Your moderator today will be Ron Canham, President of Canham & Associates in San Diego, California.
Good morning. On behalf of APWA, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for the American Public Works Association Satellite Video Conference, Managing Change in Local Government, Removing the Fear Factor. My name is Ron Canham, and I'll be the panel moderator today. And I'd like to start off by introducing our other panel members and people who will be speaking later on in today's program. First of all, Mr. Mike Kashiwagi, Director of Public Works for the City of Sacramento. Welcome, Mike. Presenting with Mike will be Ms. Jerry Macbeth, Senior Administrative Services Officer for the City of Sacramento. Welcome, Jerry. Thirdly, Mr. John Williams, Senior Vice President for HDR Engineering in White Plains, New York. Welcome, Mike. Condolences to you on what happened to the Mets last night. And fourth, Lieutenant Commander Rod Warden from the U.S. Navy Public Works Center in Pensacola, Florida.
Thank you. Good morning.
Welcome, Rod. We're excited about bringing you this special event today. Our downlink sites range from our colleagues in Canada and include such places as Ontario, British Columbia, and New Brunswick, to sites also here in the continental United States, ranging from Arizona to Florida and from Texas to Minnesota. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our studio audience sitting here with us in Kansas City. Our speakers today bring a lot of very practical experience in working with public works organizations and the change efforts that those organizations have undertaken. We hope today to benefit you by giving you some very practical, specific ideas that you can take away with you, ideas that will help you as your public works departments move towards successful changes. You and our audience, both studio and at our remote sites, have a very important role to play in today's interactive video conference also. Throughout the program, as you come up with questions or comments that you want to make for any of our speakers, you're invited to call us, fax us, or email us, and we'll answer your questions live during the broadcast. Throughout the program, we'll be rolling the telephone numbers, the fax number, and the email address at the bottom of the screen. But to start us off, I will give you those numbers if you want to jot those down. You can phone us at 1-816-410-6091. The fax number is 1-816-410-1100, or email us at apwa@kcpt.org. As I said, we'll be rolling those numbers on the screen today as we go along the program. Members of our studio audience, you're also encouraged, if you have a question, to step up to the microphone. There are times on the agenda that we'll be taking questions. I believe our first one will be at about an hour and 15 minutes from now at 11:45. Our broadcast today will be from 10:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Central Time. There will be a half-hour break from noon until 12:30 Central Time. I thought it would be a good idea to begin. I introduce myself as Ron Canham. I'm president of Canham Associates. I do work with a lot of public sector organizations on this whole issue of change, both public works departments and other departments with public agencies. And what I'd like to do is start out with maybe just a little bit more of a generic discussion about change, to look at some of the methods by which organizations try to change, maybe most critically, and some of you will recognize these, some of the reasons that change efforts fail in organizations, even though the intent is good, even though the effort and the enthusiasm is good. To talk a little bit about the transition that people go through. One of the things we found that is most difficult to get a handle on in organizations, that it's really the people that change. And what do people go through when they're asked to change? What is that emotional, psychological, neutral zone that they get into that makes it difficult to adapt and learn new behaviors and support the change process? I'll also talk just a little bit about what we call a real-time change process, kind of the key steps that need to be there for an organization to successfully change. Several years ago, I had a boss who said to me that the only person who really likes change is a wet baby. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I think what that boss was trying to say to me was this, that there is a change process that people go through that almost always starts with denial and resistance. I don't care what the change is, how big or how small it is. Most of us have a tendency that to get to acceptance and support of a change, we need to go through that denial and resistance. So what I thought I'd do is start out in no particular order to talk about some of the different methods that organizations use to change. And not so much to talk about the good and the bad, but I'm sure you'll recognize probably past efforts in your organization. And as we look at the first slide, the first handout, one of the methods by which organizations try to change is go from the bottom up, where the catalyst for a lot of the changes is at frontline level people. Oftentimes what we see there is the formation of a lot of teams. Participation is high in that method of change, and usually you will get some small incremental improvements that go on. Unfortunately, oftentimes this kind of change starts out with a fairly vague directive from management. It just says something like, we need to improve service, we need to reduce costs, we need to improve quality. And many times very few guidelines beyond that are given. So a few teams pick up the challenge, make the changes, do that, but the focus tends to be very narrow. I could probably classify that in that classic saying that oftentimes you win the battle but you lose the war. Individual pockets of improvement occur, but the whole organization or the entire department doesn't go along together. Some of you may have experience with the pilot project. And in terms of changing, usually a small department or a unit within a large department will have a lot of attention paid to it, will get the resources necessary. The people in that change effort who are directly involved in it have a lot of enthusiasm about it, and it looks like, well, the change is going to work. We've tested it and it'll work, but what happens with all the other people frequently when they're going through that change process, you start hearing things like, well, they made some improvements, but that's not really transferable for my job. That often comes up. And sometimes you'll even start hearing a little bit of jealousy about the resources that the pilot project may get, and people will say, well, why didn't we get to do that? We have a lot of issues that need resolved over here. Why don't we get to do that? The point being that not only is it a time-consuming process to go work unit by work unit, but there also becomes some animosity, and the organization is not changing together. Thirdly, and Lieutenant Commander Warden will address this a little bit later when he talks about the Navy's experience with change with Public Works, a representative cross-section, where a task force is called together from a fairly large department or an entire organization. Each work unit is represented, and they are responsible for being kind of the change effectiveness team. They're given a lot of information. They probably have a lot of enthusiasm. It's an honor to be selected to be part of that. I think one of the key questions that Rod will address with you later on is, how do we select that person? Is it the best person to select to do that? Do they have the ability to go back to their own work unit and communicate that same enthusiasm and the same ideas that they had as a member of a task force? And we'll probably have a discussion around, how do I select the people to be involved in that? Probably the change method that we are most familiar with is the old top-down, and usually we have tried some other things, we've had other programs going on, and finally we get frustrated if we're in upper management and we just say, okay, it's time to change. Starting next week or next month, we will do this. We will implement a total quality management program for things. Obviously there's going to be management support for that program, at least initially. What happens to that over time? Sometimes if we don't see results fairly quick, suddenly a lot of the managers who were part of that change initiative and wanted that to happen lose some of that support. And I think that's, and I mean this in no sense in a derogatory way, but I was once working with a company where a lot of the staff said, upper management is so whimsical about what they want to do. And I guess one of the caution I would give to those of you who are in leadership positions, when it's time to talk with people about changes that you want to see made and the direction that you're going, it's probably important that you let them know literally the agony that you and your management team went through, all the options you looked at, all the different change models you looked at, all the reasons why we believe we need to change, whether it's to improve services, reduce costs, whatever it might be. But oftentimes all we hear as frontline people is, this is where we're going, this is a change we need to make, and we're going to have to start doing things different. So I encourage organizations and their leaders to share that, literally that agony that they go through. The fifth process that we talk about, that we will be looking at today, that will be highlighted by both Mike and Jerry from the city of Sacramento, is what we call a more holistic process. where literally their experience has been that you could take a large number of people, in this case I believe some 700 or 800 people who work for the City of Sacramento Department of Public Works, and take them through a change process fairly quickly, all at the same time. Probably one of the big issues with change, we mentioned in a pilot project, we settle for little incremental changes, and that kills a lot of the enthusiasm. But I think you'll find fascinating some of their ideas about how to take a large number of people fairly rapidly through a change process. But I think regardless of the approach that you use in your organization, or that you have used or you think about using, there are several factors which can lead to failure in any change effort. And as we move on to the next handouts and slides, I want to share just a few of those with you. I think it's telling that we have 2 pages full of reasons why change efforts often fail, but I will hit on some of them and skip some of them over. We've kind of talked a little bit about the first one. There are a few try to convince the many. Probably seen most often in that top-down approach. I use the authority in my position to tell people we're going to change, and usually what happens then, there's a lot of caution and skepticism if that decision to change isn't accompanied by information, by necessary training, and people kind of wait and see what other people are going to do. Am I going to get acknowledged for that change? We can also talk about different views of the need to change. One of the things I like to do with organizations is to say, especially for non-management people, if you go to your frontline people and you say, are things changing, 95% of them will tell you no. Or do they need to change? No, I kind of do the same job every day. I kind of deal with the same issues. I may know a lot of the citizens and customers who I deal with on a first-name basis. I don't really see too many things changing here at all. That kind of creates a viewpoint that questions the need to change. Also the history of past change efforts. Were they stuck with? Were they successful? Because many times what we've learned as employees is if I just kind of duck and stay low, this fad, this program of the month that we're going through will pass, and we can go back to doing things the way we used to. We've talked already a little bit about the caution of the pace being too slow. Maybe one of the most critical places to watch out when you're in the middle of a change process is the whole idea of settling for modest change. As we initiate programs, there are probably some of the problems, issues, and concerns that are well known in the organization that we've talked about for years. We attack those immediately. Within as little as 1, 2, or 3 months, we may see some positive changes. And there's a tendency then for everybody to kind of go, good, we can sit back and rest for a while. That's a critical time to say we need to know there are many more improvements we can make, many different ways that we could do things. And that's a time to kind of push through to that. When we get into that program of the month, the organizations that have tried read Tom Peters and watched his videos, and then they've done total quality management, and then they've done continuous process improvement, all of which can be good programs. One of the main reasons that those programs often fail is they allow people to see change as a disruption in their work. It's what I do in addition to my job. Well, I'm on a quality improvement team, I'm on a process improvement team. Okay, well, as soon as I get everything done that I need to get done in my real job, then I'll work on these changes that you want. It becomes a real challenge to the organizations to integrate the change process that you are using and say, no, this is part of your real job. Looking at doing things differently, looking at the problems that need to be resolved, that is part of our job. I think we've probably talked enough about the management commitment is lacking. It often starts off strong. I would say if I gave you a little buzzword to hook onto there's 3 things to look at. I think management, oftentimes we start out in any change process talking the talk, and that's easy to do. What's needed is that consistent walking of the talk over time. I want to see the managers making necessary changes, too, that they need to make. I want to see them recognizing changes they made. I want to see them stalking that talk and see them out there in the organization finding examples of people who are trying to change and meet the organization's mandate to do work differently. As we look at the next graphic, I think that focusing on the short term is a real issue for public sector agencies simply because your leadership is subject to change every 4 to 6 years. And I have seen much support at the top from a mayor, from a city council, from a board of supervisors, from a county manager, and their elected officials dissipate because they say, I have 4 or 6 years to make a difference, to see if I can get reelected again. And you've talked to me about a change process that may be ongoing, that we may not see results in for 6 months, a year, 2 years. I can't afford to put a lot of resources into that kind of effort. And that's not a negative comment about that. That's kind of human nature, but there is that tendency to focus on what gives us short-term results. Change seldom does that. Let's skip down and look at that one of the last factors for failure, and that's that individual response. How do people respond to change? Because it's present in every change you make, and you see some of the things there, that fear or feeling that we have of loss. What kind of things are people fearful of losing? When we go through fairly significant change, status that I have in my current position, fear that I won't be able to use the knowledge that I've gained over a lot of years, that you'll ask me to do something very, very different from what I do now, fear that I won't be able to work with my friends who I've always worked with, that you'll send me out to do something different with a different work team or a different work unit. Maybe one of the biggest fears, fear of the loss of predictability. I know my job now. I know how things work. I know my supervisor. And fear of loss of job security also, obviously, is a big fear today. And it's interesting to me that people usually think first about what they have to give up. And what I would say about that is, it kind of goes back to that, I start with denial and resistance. What I would say about that to you is many times it is small things that people are worried about having to give up in a change process. Example, in working with the Veterans Administration Hospital, they had always tracked time by very informal handwritten method, allowing employees to write their hours on a time card. They went to what was called a badger system, where literally they had to get a badge, and they swiped that, a name badge, and they had to swipe that badge through a time clock. Now, if I were to ask you what's probably the biggest issue around making that kind of change, what did you think you would hear from employees? You don't trust us. Suddenly I can't write my own time. You want a clock to record it. Well, the trust was an issue. But you know what people complained about most of all? Worried about in that change, and why they didn't want to change? The name badges that they had was going to have their picture on it. And they were afraid that they would all look as ugly as we all look on our driver's license. And that was much more of an issue than the fact that it looks like management doesn't trust us, because we now, in effect, have to punch in and punch out when we go to work. So we need to find ways, which we'll talk about in just a minute, to make sure I ferret out all the possible dissent and bad news and bad feelings that people have about the change to deal with it. We've already talked about denial and resistance appearing first. I want to talk just a little bit about varying degrees of readiness, and you might look on the next slide that's entitled Change versus Transition. I don't think this is an artificial delineation, but I think many times, if you look down that left column under change, to me, many changes that occur happen just in an organization where we actually do something different. Happen fairly quickly. We see a lot of external proof of that change. But what I would rather focus on for just a little bit is the transition that people go through when they have. A couple things complicates it for organization. One, transition takes much longer than does the actual change itself, what I go through inside. Secondly, that transition varies from person to person. For some people, you may turn the whole organization upside down and they will say, okay, that's fine. For someone else, when I worked in human resources for Pima County government in Tucson, Arizona, and I asked the woman who put out our weekly county employee newspaper to move her desk about 25 feet from one side of the room to the other, she literally, ultimately quit. And I had no idea that small a change. Now, I see some of you chuckling. I know what you're saying she must have had to give up a window. Well, as a matter of fact, she did, yes. But the point was there What I saw as a manager as a very small change, as a change that was almost insignificant, was enough for this person who had so much trouble making that transition. She chose to go work for another organization. So I've always got to have my feet to the ground. I want to try and use an example, use a positive change that almost all of us either go through or desire to go through in an organization, and that's to move into management. Now, if we look at that column down there, all of us hope to aspire to be a supervisor, probably. If the day comes that I get to interview for that change, that happens fairly quickly, doesn't it? Friday afternoon, you're an employee, you've gone through the interview process. Guess what? Someone calls you at 4 o'clock, and I say, Mike, you're the new supervisor of our solid waste work team. And next Monday morning, 2 days later, Mike's the supervisor. That happens pretty quick. Does Mike know in his head he's a supervisor? Sure he does, because his new job title tells him that. There are also probably a lot of external physical things that say, oh, things have changed. Mike might get more money, although that's not always the case today. He might get a better parking space. He might have more flexibility in his job. He might have a nicer office. There are a lot of very tangible external physical things that say, oh yeah, I've done that change. But if you ask Mike on the inside, do you feel like a supervisor? Are you comfortable that you can be successful with this change and increased level of authority? That's probably not going to happen for a while. For most of us. It depends on how much training we get. It depends on what kind of issues and problems pop up for us our first few weeks on the job. It depends on how much support I get from my boss, and do I have a mentor who helps me be successful in making that big change. So even positive changes, many times we still go through a transition period where we kind of go through a neutral zone where we have to say goodbye to the old ways of doing things, just as any employee does in a change process. And I'm still questioning, I wonder if this new way is going to work. I wonder if I'm going to be a successful supervisor. So just something to think about. I think in organizations, we always talk about organizational change, but we still, those of us in leadership positions, need to look at that it's really people changing we're talking about. I'd like to go on and talk a little bit about, on the next slide, what we are referring to as a real-time change process, or that holistic approach to change. Some of the things that need to be there, regardless of how broad-based your change is, whether it's a whole organization, just a department, what kind of things will help us? Now, the reality is you're not going to go step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like it's listed here. But at some point in that change process that you are taking your department through, taking your people through, I need to think about and plan for all these. First of all, building a common database. And I mean a couple things by that. The database we think about, depending on the change. Let's say we want to improve customer service. We're tired of all the complaints that we're getting. What kind of things do I need in my database? Well, I obviously need to know, what are those complaints about? What do I hear more often than not? Where are the complaints coming from? How often do we get them? Are they centered in one work team or in several people that maybe the issue is training and not that the entire department is providing poor service? I need to start collecting that kind of data. But I also want to mention another kind of information that we don't talk about, and that's clarifying the need for people. I almost call it creating a sense of urgency in people that we need to do things differently. Not anxiety. I don't want people to get anxious and nervous about change, but I want them to see the urgency. And the key thing there that I think about, to be real upfront and level with people about why we're embarking on this change. Is it the threat of privatization? Do we just want to improve service? Do we want to improve the quality of our product? What might that be? But we need to kind of create that sense of urgency by giving people all the information that usually is reserved for management and the things that they look at in making that decision to move forward. Although I referenced it earlier, I would say to you also that second type of information that's critical to this change process, to welcome bad news and dissent. If you stop and think about it, I can ask the panel members here, they always like it when I throw surprises on them. When you've been in the middle of a change process and you find people who are not going along with the program, how are those people often then labeled or identified by management in the organization if you're not buying into where we're going? What do we say about those people?
They're the pains in the neck.
They're the pains in the neck. Exactly. They're the people with the bad attitudes. They're the people who are not the team players. And instead of doing that, I think part of that information we need to be very open to hearing in a variety of ways is, what are your problems with the changes we're proposing? What bothers you about the direction that we're taking the department or the organization? And rather be kind of accuse those people of disloyalty or worse and see them not as team players, why not say, maybe this person needs more information. Maybe that transition period they go to is much more difficult to them. Maybe they remember a change process that they were a loser in, that they were downsized out of an organization in a efficiency move. So I need to kind of focus again on the people in that change, the employees, and make sure I'm willing and very open to hear what that little voice in their head is saying all the time about the change. Why do I have to do this? I like what I'm doing right now. We tried this 5 years ago. It didn't work then, it won't work now. I got to get that out on the table so I can help people make that transition. I think another key step when we talk about a holistic approach to change is to create the future, to develop that compelling picture of success. You can call that a vision if you want to. I stay away from that word. There's a lot of negativity around these vision setting sessions where we go off to a mountaintop and sing Kumbaya and come back with some magical words that none of us disagree with. But I'm talking about a real specific picture of what our department can look like if we are successful in this change effort. Stephen Covey calls it how it turns the planning process upside down. Stephen Covey calls it beginning with the end in mind. And before you even start that process, he goes, step out there in the future and create a picture. What's it going to be like if we provide better service? And some real important questions go along with that, like what's in it for me and what are the benefits of me supporting that. But I want to give people a picture that they will get excited about. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in almost an off-the-cuff remark in the early 60s, said, a man will walk on the moon by the end of the decade. And for that entire decade, that became the vision of NASA workers, to see a man walk on the surface of the moon. Martin Luther King says it much more eloquently when he talked about, I have a dream. Now, we find that leaders are able to create those pictures for people. They're able to create places that they want them to go and get them excited about it by stepping out there in the future and saying, this is what our department can look like if we implement these changes. To not have that vision, to me, is kind of like handing an employee a jigsaw puzzle without the picture and say, here, put this together for me. Well, you might eventually get it right, but there's going to be a lot of starts and stops. There's going to be a lot of mistakes along the way. If you make enough mistakes, you get frustrated and say to heck with it and say, I'm not participating anymore. Jesse Jackson said, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think that is probably the thing to take away with you from that part about creating a compelling picture of the future for people, something that they will get excited about. What are we going to look like in 6 months or a year or 2 years if we go through this change process and are successful? The third step I would talk a little bit about, empowering strategies and actions to build commitment. I'll try and stay away from that buzzword empowering. I know that gets everyone real excited. But what we're really talking about there is how can I create a sense of ownership in people? How can I make the people feel like the change is theirs? And I would mention 4 things there that I think need to happen as you go through a strategic change process in your organization. First, you have to have as much participation as possible. You may choose to use a task force, you may choose to use a pilot project, but at some point, I got to get everybody working on changing the way we do things. That becomes critical. Whether I put them in teams, whether I have a lot of task forces to work on different problems and issues that are identified, that's kind of the choice of individual organizations. Secondly, I need to look real closely at what kind of training is needed. If I'm asking transportation workers, street workers who are out on the street repairing things to take more of an active part in building the image of the company, I probably need to train them on what are you going to do when a motorist drives up to you and stops and complains about something that you know nothing about and certainly don't have the authority or knowledge to fix for them on the spot. How do we handle those? I probably need to think about giving people that training so they can say something beside, I don't know, you'll have to call my boss at such and such a number. That's not my job. And we all know how mad that makes us when we hear that. So I need to think about what kind of training do I need to give people that is consistent with and will give them the skills that they need to carry out the change. I think thirdly, it kind of comes back to that about welcoming bad news and dissent. I have to be willing to share a lot of information with everyone who is affected by the change. That can be from why we're doing it, to the benefits to the organization, to as offensive this is to some people tuning into that radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? Workers today want to know that. What's in it for me to support the change? How will this benefit me down the road? Will I learn new skills? Does it mean a better opportunity to be promoted? We need to share those things with people, so there's a real need to share a lot of information. The fourth thing, I think, and it's probably the stickiest part of that empowering strategies and actions to build commitment in whatever change you're working on, how much authority do I give people? Many times organizations, and I lay this at the feet of management, they also say you are empowered to make decisions. And then I go out and spend $25 and I get my hand smacked for spending $25. So when I talk to people and say I need to think about how much authority do you have to act, it's okay to put parameters on that. There can be a monetary limit. There can be a finite amount of resources that they can commandeer. Not everyone has to be like Federal Express. For those of you who may know, when Fred Smith, he tries to speak, the CEO of Federal Express, past CEO, he speaks at as many Federal Express orientations as he can. And he tells people the story of the driver in Minnesota, the FedEx driver in Minnesota, who was cold, windy night in February. His job was to drive a truck and pick up all the packages out of those big FedEx locks boxes. And he pulled up to a box, 15, 20 below zero, probably colder than that with the chill factor, and the lock was frozen. He couldn't get the packages out. What did the driver do? He got in his truck, backed up, knocked the entire lock box off of its bolts, opened the doors to his Brinks-like truck, slid the lock box into the truck, and took the entire lock box to the airport, where they then thawed the lock and got the packages out. Now, a lot of employees hear that and they go, oh, you mean I can destroy $8,000 or $9,000 worth of equipment to make a change succeed? No. I think the point Fred Smith was trying to make is this is what we stand for. And based on what our values are and what we stand for, that helps define how much authority you have. If I'm pursuing answering a question for a citizen or solving a service problem for them, I probably have more authority to do something than I do if I'm just talking about changing one of our internal forms. And how does that work? But that whole issue of how much authority do I really have will help that stage. As long as people know the ground rules, they'll get excited about going in the direction of that compelling picture you gave for them. Fourthly, I think in any change process, we talk about it oftentimes being a long time ongoing process. You need to think about generating early successes, what I call quick wins. That I want to be as quickly as possible, see some visible results from the change process that we're going through to keep the enthusiasm. Several things happen when you do that. One, it keeps the enthusiasm going, and people are willing to look at making more changes to improve quality or improve service. Secondly, it gives me a chance to recognize the people who are implementing the changes and say, hey, you did a great job. That's exactly what we're looking to do. How you recognize them or acknowledge them is up to you. Usually a thank you is good enough. That's important. It also tells me that it gives me evidence that shows the effort we're going through, the sacrifice we're going through to change the way we do business is worth it. That we have protected ourselves from possible contracting out or privatization, that we are getting more positive comments from citizens instead of complaints from citizens because of what we've done. And lastly, I think when you have those quick wins and you make them very visible, that's a great way to to lessen the impact of the cynics who are still struggling along in that transition process, and they're still back there as a naysayer, and this will go away too, this too shall pass. Suddenly those people are saying, hey, more and more people are getting on board with the change to where we're going. And maybe I need to think about doing the same also. The last step there that we can talk about, getting continual help on the human side. We've probably talked enough about that. I would share with you a couple techniques that we use every once in a while when I'm meeting with people and we're going through a lot of change. I have them actually do that little self-talk exercise. I mentioned that little voice inside your head, and I have everyone get out a piece of paper and say, I want you to write down what that little voice is telling you about the changes that we're going through, the ones that you don't share with anybody else. And some of those will be, and sometimes even have them divide them into positive and negative comments. I don't have them put their name on their paper, but I say then pass it in. That gives me a real finger on the pulse of what do people in the department really think of these changes that we're proposing, because we're just going to deal with them in some kind of generic order, and we won't have to worry about who said what and who's not on board. We do them that way. Another exercise that I do with people a lot of times to try and get that, to help them get through that transition process, is to have them answer a couple questions. And it centers around the impacts of the change that we're going through. What good do you see happening, or do you anticipate happening from this? What good things? What bad things do you anticipate happening, or have already happened as a result of the change efforts that we're making? Thirdly, what do you not know about where we're going and the change? What are those fears that are still out there? And lastly, I like to find out what would they like to see happen. And more often than not, this is when you truly get people say, well, I could buy into this change if we could do this. I could get on board if we would go here. If I could have the authority to decide this, I would be okay. So those are the 5 steps. I think you will hear them in various forms as we go along today. I don't know, I would ask, are there any questions from the studio audience before we go on to other presenters? Okay. All right. I think one of the strengths of our video conferences is that we have some experts here who will work with public agencies or for public agencies and have been involved in just the kind of generic changes that I've been talking about. We're going to hear first from 2 people from Sacramento. I introduced them earlier. Mike Kashiwagi, who is the Director of Public Works for the City of Sacramento. Mike is a civil engineer. He got his degree from the University of California in Berkeley. He also served for a number of years as a manager with an engineering consulting firm, consulting with companies throughout the United States. Micah's co-presenter will be Jerry Macbeth. Jerry is a senior administrative services officer for the City of Sacramento within the Department of Public Works. She has her Bachelor of Science degree in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Oregon, which brings her a very unique perspective to how people deal with change. And Jerry specializes as an advocate specializes in organizational development strategies and improvement initiatives that take place within Department of Public Works and support their change efforts. With that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ron, and good morning. I guess to begin, I'd like to just briefly give an introduction about the City of Sacramento and specifically the Department of Public Works, kind of who we are and what we do. First of all, the City of Sacramento is a large city, a population of about 400,000 people. Geographically, it encompasses about 98 square miles. The form of government is a mayor and 8 city council members. The mayor serves at large, and the council members are elected by district, which means that they are primarily charged with serving specific geographical areas. The Department of Public Works is one of the larger departments within the city. When we describe what we do, we talk about it in terms of kind of the businesses that we're in. These include, we're responsible for the operation and maintenance of the city's street and transportation network. We're responsible for the operation and maintenance of the city facilities as well as the city fleet. We also are comprised of engineers and architects who plan, design, administer, and oversee the construction of the city's capital improvement program with regards to facilities and transportation. We're also in the solid waste business. We provide both residential and commercial solid waste services, along with recycling and garden refuse services. And then we're also in the code enforcement business, and that's primarily in the area of on-street parking and animal care. We're responsible for regulating the on-street parking on the city streets, and also we provide animal kenneling and redemption services, as well as we're responsible for the animal code enforcement. What Jerry and I are going to be sharing with all of you today is to take you through the organizational change process, which for us began in the summer of 1994. I'll begin by talking about some of the key drivers, and then Jerry will take you through more specifically the process we used, and then I'll come back and talk about the results and some of the things that we learned. As far as key drivers, so what led us into this change process? And I think it was primarily driven by the recognition that we live and work in a very demanding, competitive environment. And we strongly believe that in order for us to be successful, we needed to match the quality, quantity, cost, and types of services that we provided with the changing needs and expectations of our customers. And for us that meant adopting more of a business approach and more of a customer service approach to what we do and why we do it. And more specifically, for us that meant that we needed to improve our competitiveness and cost effectiveness, and we needed to demonstrate value to our customers in order to preserve in order to retain the privilege to continue to serve them. We also needed to change the perceptions of our customers from doing things to them instead of doing things for them. And we also needed to structure our delivery services based upon the needs of the customers versus our own convenience. And for us to achieve these outcomes required some fundamental changes in our work systems and work behaviors within the organizations. And this in turn created some of the compelling reasons that Ron talked about earlier. And for us, we had three compelling reasons. The first thing is that we needed to create an organization which understands, values, and appreciates the needs of not only our customers, but also ourselves. We needed to create an organization which believes that we are not just another governmental entity, but we're a business which must continually improve in order to stay in business. And we also needed to create an organization which continually identifies system and organizational improvements which supports quality service and customer satisfaction at a competitive cost versus trying to hold on to and preserve the status quo. As Ron talked about earlier, there are many ways of doing this. The process or the methodology that we selected was something called real-time strategic change. We went through a process of assessing different processes, and we landed on real-time strategic change because we found, or we believe, that this process was very consistent with a couple of principles that we felt important that drive our change process, and that's shared leadership and meaningfully involving people. Jerry's now going to talk about some of the specific steps we went through in our process.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Before beginning to address our organizational-wide improvement process, the next visual shows that we first needed to build a stronger, more cohesive team. We had to learn how to work better together. We also had to create unity and to foster a feeling of we versus I. At that time, in 1994, our leadership team consisted of 14 members, 10 division managers, 2 co-directors, and 2 senior staff members. We also had to build a shared understanding of what business we were in, what we wanted to be, what our key focus areas were, and what we stood for. So to get a better sense of our current situation and what our customers' perceptions were of us, the leadership team began its strategic planning process, as shown in the next visual, by gathering data from our key customers. We interviewed over 75 customers, the business community, neighborhood associations, our city officials, as well as our other city departments. And we asked 4 questions. What is your first impression when you think of public works?
What are the current or future issues facing the city? What are we doing right, or what are we doing wrong? And last, what suggestions do you have for improvements? Based on our customers' feedback and, of course, our own knowledge of our operations, the leadership team got a better understanding of why we needed to change and what we needed to do differently. So armed with that customer feedback, the leadership team next began to look for ways of involving our employees. We considered a number of ways, which Ron talked about. We looked at starting from the top down with top management. We looked at starting with the front line from the bottom up. And we also looked at a representative cross-section of employees throughout our department to pull them into our planning process. It was at this time that we discovered the real-time strategic change approach pioneered by Dan and Miller Tyson. Some of the criteria that we considered in determining how we would go about an organization-wide improvement process are listed in the next slide. Choosing options that achieve your purpose. As we looked at different ways to engage our employees, we focused on our purpose and the reasons why we needed to change our business, the way we did our business. And that purpose, that primary purpose, served as our guide through the whole planning aspects of our organizational improvement process. Walking the talk. We wanted to begin walking the talk of the kind of culture that we wanted to create in our organization. That meant creating a more inclusive culture, one that was participatory and engaged everyone at all levels. Building support capacity. We also looked at what structures and systems were in place or would need to be in place as we went through our organizational improvement efforts. For example, we looked at ways of building a more collaborative team environment. So we had to consider, did we have adequate team training? Did we have the facilities? Did we have the equipment? And most of all, did we have the support staff for these activities? We also looked at logistical constraints. In bringing all 800 employees together, this meant we had to really look at the reality of our organization. In our case, shutting down an entire operation with all of our employees attending one large meeting probably wouldn't be realistic. So we had to consider all possible constraints and even those that maybe through some creative thinking we could overcome. And last, everything that you do sends a message. We realize that during times of change, people are hypersensitive, and they look for underlying meanings in all decisions. So it was important that we send consistent messages to all of our employees during our organizational improvement process. After evaluating several approaches, we designed an improvement process based on the principles of real-time strategic change, as Mike indicated, because we felt that this approach was most compatible to our belief of shared leadership and meaningfully involving all of our employees. We also believed that we could achieve rapid and sustainable change in our organization if we involved everyone at one time. I'll briefly go over some of the principles that Ron also went over in his introductory remarks on real-time strategic change. The first is that reality is a key driver, that simultaneous and oftentimes conflicting realities exist in an internal and external environment of an organization. The second is that you need to build and maintain a common database to create shared meaning by building and maintaining a common understanding of the important issues facing an organization that are based on diverse perspectives. Third, empowerment and participation. Develop commitment to and an alignment with a shared purpose by engaging people in ways that matter to them and in which they can make a valuable contribution. Create community. Develop an environment where people come together as part of something larger than themselves and that they create and actually believe in. Preferred future. By bringing the preferred future into the present, and thinking and acting as if the future were now actually will accelerate the pace of change. And then finally, real time refers to the simultaneously planning and implementing of change. And as we found under this approach, the design of our organizational improvement efforts actually had to be very flexible and responsive to the emerging needs of our group. So with these guiding principles, our next visual will illustrate that the next step in our process was to actually create a design team whose members were representative of our entire organization. That team's purpose would be to design a process that everyone's voice would be heard in creating the future of public works. At this time, the leadership team also began meeting with our managers and supervisors to introduce the design team concept and process. Our managers and supervisors, as shown in this next visual, began face-to-face meetings with their employees, explaining the need for change, explaining the design team process and concept, and also soliciting nominations for employees to serve on our design team. We received over 150 nominations, and the final design team consisted of 23 members that was a representative cross-section of the department. We based on our selection on a number of factors. We looked at ethnic and gender diversity, age, job level, job classification. Also, work site location was important for us because Public Works is not in one facility. We're spread out throughout the city. We also wanted to look at a relative balance between field operations personnel and technical staff. We also wanted to make sure that there was a representative from each of our 10 divisions. We also looked at length of service, and then finally an individual's willingness and ability to participate on the team. So once the design team members were selected and chartered, we then sought support, as the next visual shows, from our city leaders for our organizational improvement efforts. With leadership's involvement, the design team presented to our city manager, his executive team, and other city departments information about our planning efforts, asked for their support, and in some cases, actually their participation in our meetings. The next two slides show the design team reaching out to our employees. The design team began to get the word out through newsletters, flyers, and presentations to employees, creating interest and enthusiasm about the upcoming events. Also at this time, we felt it was crucial that we meet with our managers and supervisors to gain a common understanding about their anticipated future roles. We met with our managers and supervisors to talk about their changing roles, and we previewed a video called Flight of the Buffalo. And in this video, it described the changing roles of our managers and supervisors and illustrated this, as seen in this next visual, by drawing a comparison between buffalo and geese. That buffalo are unable in a herd to function without their leader. They are directionless, whereas geese in flight can rotate their leaders if they need to and find their destination. In addition, managers and supervisors also received training in communication, facilitation, and coaching skills so that they would be prepared to help their employees as we transition to a more customer-focused and business-oriented organization. At this point, we would like to show a short video clip to give you a sense of what actually occurred during one of our large-scale meetings.
And for all of us,
Division managers kicked off the first day by explaining why change was needed.
What we've got to do is find a way to prove that we are the best person, the best team for the job, and that's why we needed to institute some changes.
This was going to be the chance for everyone, from sanitation workers to design engineers, frontline workers to managers, to have their voice heard and to work as a team developing the department's direction and goals. Seated at tables alongside others from across the department, people began suggesting changes they would like to see.
Hopefully out of this two-day deal, we can get something like that to where not everything has to come from the front office.
Everyone wants to know which way the city's going and better communications with the supervisors.
Department managers encouraged everyone to participate.
I'd like to talk a little bit this morning. You are the experts because you're
There
the
were
ones who have
questions employees
experience.
wanted to ask.
Answer it. We would like to know how long it'll take to implement this change. When will we see some results?
How do we measure change? Will we have the support from management and the management team to implement change?
Employees began to compile 2 lists. The first list itemized positive factors they felt were working well within the department. The second list contained items employees thought were not working in Public Works, areas that needed improvement. Next, participants got a chance to hear from the people they serve, their customers. A panel representing private businesses, community groups, and city residents, even other city departments served by Public Works, spoke candidly to the group about their experiences with the department's employees.
And some other things, but overall, and we've got some individual people that aren't doing their jobs, individual city people, that makes everybody look bad.
Employees took time out to discuss some of the things they had just heard. Employees responded with questions of their own.
And did the city, as a business entity, try to come up with alternative solutions to your problem?
What can we do more than we're doing right now to help you succeed?
On day 2, participants were greeted with a revised version of the plan, incorporating their changes from the day before. Employees were asked to identify any gaping holes or killer concerns. Changes receiving overwhelming support were included in the final version. Participants shared their vision of the department's preferred future.
As ourselves, we talk like flexible work schedules, a nice COLA, anything else. So solution for I-time/sick leave.
How about employee development? Our goal is to encourage all employees to succeed through training and educational opportunities.
Everyone voted for actions they thought deserved further consideration. Volunteers reported out the top vote getters.
Including evaluations of supervisors by employees.
The top actions were noted.
Our long-range goals is to see a new program developed for scheduling. We just feel that the people who actually work the program or do the scheduling weren't asked what they need.
And our final recommendation is we provide quality public works services with pride and dedication to ensure a higher quality of life for the city of Sacramento.
All that agree, please stand. Okay, that looked like it was the 2/3.
Once the mission, vision, values, and goals were finalized, the group turned its attention to a list of recommended initiatives suggested by the 4 workout groups. Participants considered potential roadblocks to accomplishing their initiatives, as well as possible supports.
Biggest roadblock that I see happening is if we as a group don't get off our butts and do something. In some ways, the real roadblock is ourselves.
When people are using I-time not correctly, it's costing every one of us because we have to pick up their load, we have to use overtime, so the cost of our service.
Participants prioritized each of their initiatives. Operations that supported the agreed-upon goals and could be accomplished in a reasonable time frame moved to the top of the list. The entire assembly voted on the top 5 initiatives they favored most. A group of volunteers joined with department managers to prioritize the initiatives for implementation. The final Public Works plan was now complete, and every member of the Public Works Department had played an active role in its creation. As participants ready to go out and implement the plan, they reflected on their experience at Workout 96.
When it's all here together and everybody's putting their input, it's really helpful to me because I'm finding things out and learning things that I didn't even know before.
I really like the well-rounded idea of us getting together and having a small fraction from each one of us get together so that we can share ideas.
After this, I'm going to make this commitment that when we go back, I'm going to go to the meeting open-minded and listen. And when we go back, we're going to use a format just as we do here, and that's how it's going to happen. That's what I'm going to do. That's my commitment, because I want to see it work.
We finally got together to see we all share the same interest. We know where our goal is now. We know where we need to head. We know who's weak. We know where to fine-tune that. I'm kind of glad we did have this thing because it's been a long time coming.
In the first few scenes of the video, you may have noticed some of the presenters and some of the participants, they were wearing warm-up or exercise outfits. And that's because the design team had incorporated a physical fitness theme for our large-scale meetings. And they called the meetings Workout 96. The theme was based on the idea of strengthening our future or building our future. And using this theme enhanced the team's ability also to promote the team meetings to our employees in a fun and upbeat way. The team designed a series of back-to-back two-day meetings where everyone would come together to develop a shared vision and ways to improve our organization. So that city services were not disrupted, the team decided to divide the meetings into 4 groups of 200 employees each, with the group meetings over 4 consecutive weeks. And then from each group, 25% were selected to attend a final 2-day meeting, and we called the final 2-day meeting a convergence meeting. And the purpose of that was to take all of the data generated from the previous 4 meetings and put that into a written plan of action. At the convergence meeting, our employees helped us define what business we were in, where we wanted to be, what our key focus areas were, and what we stood for. This plan, illustrated in the next visual, is now commonly referred to as our organization's MVVGs, or mission, vision, value, and goals. At the convergence meeting, this next visual illustrates everyone's agreement on department-wide actions, which again were collected from the data from the previous 4 meetings. Next, we identified the top initiatives that we needed to work on to achieve our preferred future. In this next visual, a group of 20 employees volunteered during the convergence meeting to work with the leadership team to determine how to prioritize and move forward with our initiatives. During the action planning phase, teams were established to work on the top 5 initiatives from a list of 10 as shown in this next visual. These teams and their members were a representative cross-section of employees from throughout the organization. Their purpose was to review the initiatives and to develop recommendations for improvement. The top 5 initiatives were navigating the Public Works Flight Plan. This initiative created a team called the Navigation